investigator at the Salk Institute for Biological Studies in San Diego, and I am serving as this year's tutorial chair for Cosyne. And in that capacity, I would like you to join me in welcoming Dr. Eva Dyer, an associate professor in the Department of Biomedical Engineering at Georgia Tech. For now, should I say? Yeah, for now. Some exciting announcements regarding affiliation soon, I hope. Dr. Dyer leads the Neural Data Science Lab at Georgia Tech, also known as the NERDS Lab. Definitely one of the top lab acronyms I've encountered, focusing on data-centric AI, representation learning, and AI for science. After earning her bachelor's in electrical and computer engineering, completing her master's and PhD in the same field at Rice, Dr. Dyer serves as a research scientist in the Department of Physical Medicine and Rehab at Northwestern. And in 2017, joined Georgia Tech and Emory as an assistant professor in biomedical engineering. Her interests align the intersection of machine learning, optimization, and neuroscience, and her lab develops computational methods for discovering the principles that govern the organization and structure of the brain. She's been recognized with a very numerous number of honors, including the Sloan Research Fellowship, an NSF Career Award, the McKnight Foundation Technological Innovations in Neuroscience Award, and recently the CFAR Azrieli Global Scholar Award. Please, once again, join me in welcoming Dr. Dyer.
Great. Thank you all for being here. This first day kicking things off with a bang. If you haven't already, we're going to be having an interactive session after the kind of introduction that I'll give at the beginning. And so you can find the materials for the interactive part in Colab notebooks here with this QR code through our tutorial website. So please do open that up and for when we get going a bit later. Okay, great. All right. So I'm really excited to tell you today about some work that we've been doing over the past year and a half to, as you'll discover, basically build out new tools for training deep learning models on neural data. And the topic of the tutorial will actually be the foundations of transformers in neuroscience. So we're going to be spending some time going through the basics of transformers, motivating, why transformers for neural data, and in particular thinking about the advantages of these tools as we start to scale up and build larger and larger models that can actually coalesce data from many different sources and many different brains. And so, we'll talk about the kind of basics of transformers, and then I'm going to be telling you all about these 3 new packages that we're releasing that are now in pip, and talking about the kind of features of those, and then we're all going to be able to actually get our hands dirty working through some examples of training some of these models. And welcome in. We have another group of folks. So before I get started, I just wanted to start by just acknowledging the team of amazing folks that have really made this possible. So first, I'd like to acknowledge and thank Mehdi Azabu and Vinam Arora. Both of them have really been the life force behind the creation of TorchBrain, which I'll tell you about, which is kind of the culmination of these different packages for deep learning for neuroscience, both co-creators. Mehdi, unfortunately, couldn't be here today. We're so sad that he's not with us, but due to all the travel regulations and crazy stuff happening, he wasn't able to make it today. Vinam is here. I'd also like to thank Shiva Mahato, so he also helped to co-create co-create the materials that you'll all be experiencing today. And then we also have an amazing group of TAs that will be going around answering questions and helping you all with the materials. So Cole, Divyansha, Nanda, Jimeng, Avery, and Jingyun are here. Thank you all for your contributions. These are also folks that have been working intimately with TorchBrain, providing feedback, and really helping us to launch what we'll be able to share with you today. And then we have a number of other contributors that helped us to, with the notebooks. So Alex, Ian, Sergey, and Julie. And this is, as you'll see, a really big and kind of collaborative effort. And so this is joint effort between my lab at Georgia Tech, Guillaume and Blake Richards at Mila, as well as Liam Paninsky's group at Columbia as part of the Arnie Institute. So, if you can all join me in just like giving everyone a big round of applause. Thank you, thank you. So they're really the ones that made all this happen. And I'm just excited to be able to tell you about it. All right, I'm just gonna kind of quickly go through our schedule for today just to kind of orient us. So the first about 50 minutes or so, or hour, I'll be talking about transformers and their application in neuroscience. And then at that point, we'll start transitioning over to the Colab notebooks and more interactive session. And then in that, we're going to have two kind of main notebooks that you'll see on the website that I shared at the beginning. For those of you that came in a little bit later, you should be able to find a link to the website on the Whova and the Cosyne tutorial link. And so we'll do two things. The first is really just kind of describing the tools and infrastructure to kind of create data sets within this framework. We'll get a lot of chance to visualize data, go through some examples, and then we'll have a little bit of time for you to start playing with it. There's going to be a break from 2:15 to 2:45. And then in the second part of the tutorial, we're going to go through some examples of building a few different deep learning models, so both like a simple multi-layer perceptron as well as two different transformer models. And then we'll also talk about fine-tuning at the end. So the idea that we could have a pre-trained model that we can then adapt to a new data set from a new brain. Okay, so that kind of sets the stage. There's been a lot of progress in generative AI and AI in many different domains that have given us some insights into the fact that scale, or the amount of data that we can actually ingest into these models, can really matter and can really play a significant role. And so we think that scale is an important concept also in neuroscience, because the brain, as we all know, is a very complex and very high-dimensional system. And so potentially, as we're trying to learn mappings between the brain and behavior, this could be a very complex system or function that we need to learn. And what we know in many domains of AI is that sometimes you need enough data to actually start to reveal very complex nonlinear mappings. And so it may be that, looking at one data set or from one brain or from one particular configuration of neural states may not give us a full picture of what the brain is doing. And so we really advocate for, and we'll talk about the use of scaling as a potential benefit for learning these complex functions. And so the way that we kind of envision this is that, most data sets that we capture in neuroscience are from a limited number of individuals, right? Small number of subjects potentially. Measuring the brain in particular configurations or certain states of consciousness, and only for some limited amount of time, right? We can't record a brain for all of its lifetime yet, maybe in C. elegans. And so really we're seeing these kind of small subsets or pictures of what brain activity looks like. And so perhaps through, combining and coalescing all of these sources of neural or information about the brain, we can start to kind of stitch together a more coherent and unified picture of what the brain is doing and how it's computing. And I think that this really kind of, this visualization provided by Dan Berman, of part of the International Brain Laboratory Visualization Team, gives us some picture of what we might expect to see. So this is looking at or visualizing the activity of neurons that were collected through the IBL of over 100 different mice or animals. And what we can see here is that by starting to stitch together or put together all of these data sets, we start to get a much bigger range of coverage and ability to actually see what's going on across almost the whole brain during an underlying task. So this, I think, just really nicely encapsulates some of the goals and ideas behind this idea of scaling up and aggregating more and more sources of data from the brain. Okay, and so this provides some sort of setting or motivation for maybe why scale and integration of a lot of data sets could be important. And so, what we've seen in a lot of other domains is that transformers kind of form the basis for a lot of the advances in modern AI systems. So we've seen that in language, things like ChatGPT, right, and all of these amazing LLMs that have come out and, provide these really amazing capabilities, as well as vision or vision language models and in many other forms of sequence data. And so today we'll talk about, what are transformers and how can we apply them to neural data. And I'll talk through in some level of detail, kind of what are the building blocks and how do we go about thinking about, how do we take some of these tools that have been established in these other domains and port them into our study of the brain. Okay, and I guess I'll also say that one of the really one advantage of transformers is that they're very flexible systems that allow for processing of many different types of modalities. And so I think that hopefully I'll convince you that this is particularly important for neuroscience because often in our data sets we collect many different sources of information that tend to be multimodal, right? So maybe we're recording aspects of behavior, which is a continuous stream of temporal information. And then we're recording spikes, right, which are irregular sequences of events. And what is the trial structure? When did the animal start to solve a task or not? And so transformers give us a way in which we can process multimodal data very effectively. Okay, so now I will talk about the basics of transformers. So what is a transformer and how does it work? The starting point is to take this data, maybe if we're thinking about language, we have a sentence which is comprised of a sequence of parts of words or words. And in an image, right, we can think about different patches or regions of the image, all being different pieces of this global piece of information that we want to understand. So what we do is we're going to start by forming or creating tokens, which basically give us a way of representing these different sources of data. And so, as I was saying, in the context of language, maybe each token is a different word that we might try to build some sort of insight across. So transformers represent sequences or general information as a set or sequence of tokens. And these tokens have two main kind of pieces of information that define them. And so a token is going to be represented both by its content, so it could be the actual word that we're looking at in the sequence, or the specifics of what's happening within a part of the visual field. And in addition to the content, we also are going to have some notion of position. And so I'll talk about that just in a very general sense, but we could think about in language, the position could be as easy as the beginning or the end of the sentence, right? We want some way to provide the transformer with information about where in the sequence this content is occurring. And so here I just have a simple example of 6 tokens, and each of them are going to be represented by the content X and their position P. Okay, so the main building block of transformers is something called self-attention. And so what does self-attention do? It allows for the exchange of information across all of the tokens within our sequence. So in contrast to, say, like an RNN or a current model that only looks at nearby points in its distant past in order to predict the future, the transformer allows all-to-all connection and flow of information across the whole sequence and across all the tokens. And so the main building block for self-attention is first, we will define for all of the content or the information in each of our tokens, we're going to define 3 different objects, a set of queries, a set of keys, and a set of values. And each of these are going to be computed by basically multiplying all of our tokens or all of the information in our sequence, so all these X's, by some weight matrix to build these queries, keys, and values. And so what we can see here is that the dimension of the output of these will be the same number of tokens as what went in, but we could potentially change their dimensionality. So here's just an example where we have 2 tokens being multiplied by this weight matrix, and so we still have 2 representations coming out, but they could be of a different dimension. Okay. So we can kind of think about now these keys and queries as being a way for all of the tokens to talk to each other or ask for information from other parts of the sequence. And so the actual way of computing the attention scores through this computation of self-attention is given by this equation here. And really this is going to be driven by the inner product between a query from the ith token and a key from the jth token. And this is going to be all-to-all. So if I send out a query that I'm looking for certain types of information, all of the other tokens can give me their keys from which I can compute this inner product and calculate my attention score. And then this here is just a softmax normalization. So we can think about this as basically being kind of sparsifying the attention scores that I'm receiving from all of those other tokens within the sequence. And then finally, the output of this self-attention block, which is parameterized by these queries and keys and values that we defined, is now just going to be the sum of the values for all of the jth tokens, scaled by these attention scores. So in the end, the output for token I is going to be given by this equation here. Okay. So, and I know that, we're just getting going, and this is being filmed or whatever, but I really do hope if people have questions and want to interrupt at any point, please do. And, I'd be happy to clarify. Yes, okay, perfect.
What's going to be the size of those W matrices?
So the W matrices will have some fixed dimensionality depending on what we want the output dimension of the values or keys or queries to be. So in this example, we have like a 4x3 matrix.
If you have many tokens, if you have 10,000 tokens, is it going to be larger?
So each of the tokens are going to be multiplied by the weight matrix in order to get a value out. Yeah. Okay. Okay, so one thing that I didn't exactly describe yet is the idea of the position embeddings. And so in the previous slide, I talked about how the tokens are going to be used to compute these attention scores and the outputs. And so we can think about the position information in the easy example that I gave before. So if we have a sequence, say, of words, the position could be as simple as, marking the beginning and the end. There are things called sine, cosine position embeddings, which give us a way of kind of parameterizing or dividing an interval into a kind of fixed set of intermediate positions. But just in general, we can actually think about this as a very general concept that tells us how the different tokens within our sequence or our data are connected, either in time or space. And so on the left, I'm just showing an example of like relative position encoding, where nearby tokens are going to weigh each other's attention or be kind of more influential in sending messages to one another. And this can kind of be visualized here by this idea that if this is my central token, I might be influenced more heavily by other tokens within my surrounding. But in more general terms, we can also think about encoding position in a more arbitrary way. Yes?
So, I think there is overlap between the precision embedding and the precision you mentioned in your previous slides. Right? So, I think we have different contributions.
Yeah. I kind of simplified things a little bit. So typically, you'll have some way of encoding the position of each of your tokens, and typically, we'll actually add the position embedding to the content embedding before we go about solving or computing the self-attention and different scores. So for many transformers, you'll actually add the position encodings to the content and then apply the self-attention operation. We'll see some models that actually integrate the position information into the attention calculation directly. So there are different ways in which you can integrate position information. We'll talk about a model called POYO, which was developed in my lab, which uses relative position encoding, which actually does this modulation of the attention scores based upon the absolute difference between the two tokens in time. So yeah, there are different ways, and what I'm showing here is a little bit of an abstraction where I'm looking at it in terms of how the attention is going to be modulated by the position information. Yeah, thank you. It's a good clarifying point. And so over on the right, I'm just showing an example where we could even take this to the extreme. So maybe it's not sequential or temporal data at all, but maybe we have information about how the different tokens are connected to one another, for instance, in a graph. And in that case, we could also visualize, basically, if two nodes are connected, they can then impact the attention or basically flow information across all of those interconnected nodes. So this gives us a sense that the transformers are actually a very general concept that can be used in many different data structures. It's not just in sequential data, but also in graphs and in other domains that might not have a well-defined kind of notion of position a priori. Okay, so now that we've covered the basics of what are transformers, the tokenization idea, as well as self-attention, we'll now transition into talking about, how do we apply these sorts of models to neural data? And we'll talk about a few different examples of that that have come out over the past few years since this has kind of really started to get going within neural data analysis. Okay, and so in order to talk about the applications of transformers to neural data, there will be kind of three main ingredients. First is how do we tokenize neural data, right? How do we turn it into this sort of content and position information that I've talked about? Step two is what type of architecture will we choose? And so what I talked about is just a basic building block of a transformer or a kind of standard self-attention mechanism. But there's other forms of architectures and other ways to process this type of data using self-attention, or sorry, just using attention in general. And then step three is, how do we optimize, or what is the goal, or what is the underlying objective of the transformer? What is it trying to predict? Okay, and so we'll first talk about tokenization, and then move on to the other parts. Sorry? Huh? What's up? Oh. Okay, so step one, tokenization. So I think many of us are very familiar with the idea of kind of taking populations of neurons and turning them into some, say, vectorized or some input for our population level models. And so this first introduction, or this first transformer for neural data, or the NDT, utilizes a kind of simple slicing, temporal slicing and patch-based tokenization to prepare the neural data for later processing. And so we can think about, just a simple example where we have 3 neurons that are firing action potentials or emitting these spiking events, which are depicted here. And that's happening over time. So first we can kind of imagine, if we have a really long recording, just taking a chunk out of it, so a context window over which we'll build and tokenize the neural data. And so a simple way to start would just be to choose a bin size, so amount of time over which we're going to count the number of spikes or compute the firing rate of a neuron. And now what we can do is we can basically slice along space, so looking at what is the firing rate of all D neurons that I've recorded from jointly, and make that into our token. So we can see here this example. So the first neuron emitted 2 spikes, and then 1 and 0. So that would result in this vector 2, 1, 0. And that's kind of the first raw part of our token. We'll typically then process that with like a small MLP to map that neural population vector into a token vector of some fixed dimension. And so the same would happen for this next chunk in time, 1, 1, 2, and we'll process that through an MLP. And the output of that will be 5 tokens that we would use in this sequential, or in the transformer. So another way that we can kind of consider the tokenization is, instead of grouping together all of the neurons into one token, we can also actually split everything by different channels or by neurons. And so this work from 2022, EIT was the first to propose this kind of idea of channel level tokenization. And one of the motivations for this work is that, different brains or different neural populations will have different dimensionality. And so when we choose to group all of the neurons into one token, we're kind of assuming things about the ordering and the dimension of the neurons that we want to process, right? And so the motivation of this work was to actually allow for some amount of generalization by doing tokenization at the channel level. So here we can imagine, actually taking each neuron and splitting it into bins over time, and then processing all of the neural activity for each neuron through an MLP or through some small model in order to get a representation or tokenization of the data. And so we can see that, this provides some ability to now understand if our tokens are at the level of individual neurons, we can start to understand how those different neurons are actually interacting through the transformer, right? Sorry, yeah. Oh, so an MLP is a multi-layer perceptron, thank you, which is really just a sequence of linear layers followed by some sort of activation function. And so this is kind of maybe one of the simplest neural network models that one might consider utilizing. And we'll talk more about it in the interactive session. We'll actually go through a basic MLP. Oh, yeah. So we will get there. At this point, I'm just talking about how do we tokenize the neural data. But there's different objectives, right? So in the case of ChatGPT or a lot of other ChatGPT is more of a forward prediction model. So the idea is can you predict what the next token will be, right? There's also masked models, which mask out different parts of the input. And the goal of the model is to fill in those missing components. Or you can train it in a supervised way, right? And so you could train these models to also predict behavior, predict a stimulus, predict any sort of, either input or output to the neural system as well. Yep. Sorry, say that again?
So if you use single neural activity
Yeah.
as one token, that means that the weight embedding, the weight you do embedding, right, the dimension is equal to the time duration.
Yes.
So that means that if you want to train a foundation model, use a super long duration. That could not work.
Yeah. So these first few models were kind of initial attempts at defining new ways to use transformers on neural data, but these models were actually not used to scale yet. So I'm going to get into some examples of how we can address some of those challenges in some of the future slides. But yeah, you point out a good point, the dimensionality with this type of approach is going to grow significantly. We're going to do that next. Yes, great idea. That's what we thought too. Actually, not this one, the next one. And then, that same year, there were also some works to take neural activity and actually process two different types of patches. So in this work, STNDT, which is in 2022, they actually have an architecture where they both do attention over space or over different neurons, as well as over time through two different kind of parallel branches within the transformer architecture. So here they both create spatial as well as temporal patches. And then to the suggestion from the attendee back there, more recently, or in 2023, we introduced a model called Pollo, which sidesteps the need to bin entirely and really tries to use the true nature of neural data, at least at the spiking level, where you have events that become your tokens. And so here within Pollo, we'll also define a context window. And now really the idea is to treat each spike or each event as a token, which is sort of shown here. And now when we flatten out, create a sequence where each spike is a token, there's kind of two main things that we need to be able to communicate to the model. One is the neuron that it came from, and the second one is the time at which the event occurred, because we're no longer binning and kind of collapsing things into these fixed bins any longer. And so now we can actually use the real timing or the absolute timing information as a kind of key ingredient that goes into the transformer. How do I normalize time? So in this case, we'll define a context window, and over that context window, we can define just the unit time. So we'll assume that it's starting from 0. A lot of times the context windows that we'll use, at least in this model, are about 1 second. And so we can, accumulate all the spikes that were emitted over some fixed amount of time, and then start from 0 as absolute time, and then kind of parameterize them accordingly. Okay, and so now we can kind of think about, okay, what is this unit embedding, how do we convey information about the different neurons and the spikes that they're emitting? And within this particular framework, what we do is we allow the model to learn some embedding vectors for all of the neurons that were observed throughout the experiment. And in language, we can think about the content of each token, right, or each word as potentially having some sort of semantic embedding, right, where we're looking at the word dog, or we look at the word cat, and maybe the representations of those two words might be close within this embedding space. And similarly, we envision that through this learnable neuron level embedding that we use in the tokenization, we might also be able to discover similar semantics and organization. So, neurons that might have similar receptive fields or have similar tuning properties, or maybe being from the same cell type, could actually be then mapped to similar latent vectors within this embedding space. And so this is something that is learned by the model over time. And now each of our tokens are going to consist of this neuron level learnable embedding, as well as the temporal information about when the event was fired. And we've extended this, or also been able to take a similar approach to tokenized calcium imaging data. So now, instead of having spikes, you actually have a regular time series of information based upon the calcium signal. And so in this case, we can use basically the same idea of having a neuron level embedding for each of the neurons. But instead of having spikes, we're going to just represent every single timestamp as a token, and then also add information about the amplitude of the time series at that particular point in time. And so these are kind of really give us a range of different possible ways of taking, multivariate time series or irregular time series of events and boiling them down into a format where we can then, put them into a transformer model and optimize and build some desired outputs. Okay. So the next step is to consider, now that we have a tokenization, or a way of taking the neural data and turning it into tokens, we can also consider some different forms of architectures that have been leveraged for this. And so in a number of kind of existing models, so NDT, so far I talked about NDT1, but there's been some nice extensions. And I think we'll talk a little bit more, but they use very similar tokenization schemes as what I described for NDT. Also multitask masking, which is some recent work out of Columbia, as well as the EIT, all use kind of standard self-attention blocks or transformers in order to build inferences about the neural data. And in addition to self-attention, in Poyo, we also introduce a novel architecture or leverage the perceiver I/O, which was originally used in time series or audio modeling and in LLMs, and adapting that to neural data as well. And so the idea behind the perceiver, or behind this idea of cross-attention, is now imagine that, we take a second-long context window, and if we have 1,000 neurons, we might have a ton of tokens, right, depending on the firing rate. But if we only look at 10 neurons, we'd have a much smaller sequence. And so one of the advantages of using this mechanism is it allows us to deal with highly variable length sequences, and instead of computing attention across all of the tokens, which could be very long or short sequences, we instead will use cross-attention to basically take all of those high-dimensional tokens and project them into a latent bottleneck, or a set of fixed latent tokens. And so this is sort of depicted here. So now, instead of the queries, the keys, and the values all being defined over the tokens in our input, we're instead going to have a set of learned latent tokens that will provide the queries, and then the spike tokens, or the inputs, are going to provide the keys and the values. So we can think about that as like this learned latent token might have certain rules that it's looking for within the spike sequence, right? Maybe it's querying the firing rate of neuron 1 or neuron 10. Or maybe another query could be something about the sequence of spiking events that occur across an ensemble of neurons. So it's a very general concept. These queries can now look over the entire sequence and look for different types of information that it's interested in extracting. Yes? Yeah, I think that in essence, this would tend to have this kind of, like rank limiting effect, right? Like through this kind of bottleneck or mapping to this latent dimension. What's nice, however, is that, so whereas, say, the complexity of the self-attention mechanism, say we have n tokens, it's going to be n squared, right? Because we have to compute aij's over all of the possible pairs. We're now going to have a computation that's n times L. And then all of the further computations will be in the latent bottleneck, so it's more like L squared. Right? And so, yeah, it has a similar effect, but this, gives us a way of reducing computation as well, without having to explicitly compute the all-to-all connectivity. Okay, great. So once we have used this cross-attention mechanism to basically take the potentially large set of spike tokens and put them down into this set of learned latents, we then will apply multiple rounds of self-attention within the latent space to kind of compute more and more complex sources or pieces of information from the data. And I guess, yeah, I can just say this here. So with Poyo and Poyo Plus, we train the model, which I'll talk about next, with the optimization to solve different supervised decoding tasks. And so one thing that's nice is just like we were able to query from, what I want to say is we were representing each of our spike tokens as irregular events with kind of continuous time values. Similarly, at the output, we're also going to apply a cross-attention mechanism to now basically query from the latents, and then what we'll get out are some observations of some behavior that we want to predict. And so this also allows us to basically query at irregularly spaced intervals, or perhaps you have different behaviors that are happening at different frame rates or different times. This is a really flexible mechanism that allows you to query at any arbitrary point in time in order to produce some resulting behavioral covariates of interest. Okay, and then step 3 is what is the, oh, okay, we're getting there. Okay, step 3 is what is the objective? What do we want to train these models to do? And so a number of models in the community have there's 2 main approaches, so both unsupervised as well as supervised models. The first kind of main core set of techniques that have been successful have all been masked modeling approaches. And so these models here all take this same type of approach, where the idea is that you're going to mask out different tokens of however you've tokenized your data, but masking out portions of neural activity. And then the goal of the transformer is to learn a really rich representation such that it can look at the context of what else is going on within the neural recording, and then it can predict what the activity was for those held out neurons or time points. This visualization here is from this multitask masking paper, MTM, where they actually introduced a number of different mass modeling objectives that challenge the model to learn, different ways to predict neural activity from its context. And so maybe a standard approach that has been explored in the past is this idea of co-smoothing, so masking out a random number or configuration of neurons and trying to predict what those neurons were doing. But in addition to this co-smoothing objective, they also show that introducing causal prediction tasks, so can I predict what's happening in the future with these neurons, as well as region-level specific masking. So in this case, they were working with neuropixels, and so in that case, you actually have activity that's spanning many different brain areas. And so you can also play a lot of cool tricks to essentially mask out an entire brain region's worth of activity and see if, given the other brain regions, you might be able to predict what was going on within that held-out region. Or an inter-region prediction task where you mask out all the other regions and then you just try to use your local regional information to predict what's going on within a held-out neuron. And so really the field has evolved a lot just over the past few years. And so this model really shows us that there can be a lot of diverse ways in which we can actually challenge models through these sorts of masking prediction tasks. And then, of course, in many neuroscience experiments, we care about taking brain activity and predicting either some aspect of, some aspect of the inputs coming in or the motor behaviors coming out. And so within these models, the goal in the end is to be able to predict some aspects, say, of motor activity or stimulus in a visual condition. Yes? The Fano factor? Oh, like in the prediction and the outputs, how effective is the actual activity, so these are all binned, so we don't exactly get the spike times directly. But it's a really great question. We have some folks so Cole is here, he was the senior author on this work, so maybe during the breaks we can chat a little bit more about some of the investigations there. It's a good question. Yeah, maybe you have a specific hypothesis we could talk about. Okay, so yes. Yes, so that's a good question. So there are 2 different ways in which you can take the pre-trained model. Well, so in one case, you could assume that you've held out some trials right, or some chunks of time from the model. You've trained your foundation model, and now you ask, okay, well, how well does this predict on those held out trials? In many cases, that's a standard thing, like just zero shot, right, where I just put in the new data and then I can predict. But then in some of these models, in particular POYO, where you have these unit embeddings, right, so it's some content information about each of the neurons that has been learned throughout training. So in that case, the pre-trained model has no access to information about brand new neurons that it's never seen before. And so what we show in a number of these works is that you can fine-tune or you can actually relearn the unit embeddings for a new collection of data from a new brain that it's never seen before with a small amount of labeled data. So at this point, you can transfer onto new animals, but you need some way of figuring out aspects of the new neurons that it's never seen before. Yep. So I think that it's still under investigation. I think there are some approaches that are, moving us closer towards something that could be more zero shot in the same way that an LLM is like, I just put in, imagine it's kind of like, okay, I wanna go into the LLM, but I speak a completely different language that it's never seen before. I can still prompt it, but it doesn't know what my language is, right? And it can't fit into the context of what it's seen before. And so I think neuroscience is really unique in that, when we just have a collection of neurons that are doing stuff, there's no way to, uniquely identify individual neurons without some way of kind of realigning things. In our prior work, we did show that you can hold all of the weights of the transformer fixed, and you can just update the unit embedding. So basically give it the new, translation of the new language without having to change the rest of the model. So that at least, shows us that the rules that it's learned are applicable. It's just that we need to figure out this initial translation step. That's a good question. And we will be going more through fine-tuning in the interactive session. Okay. Yes?
When creating POYO, did you look at any of this mass modeling generative approaches to neural data, or were you really just focused on behavior as an output?
So I think, there's been an evolution of things. Because this was a whole new way of tokenizing the data, new architectures, we chose to start with the supervised task. But a number of folks on our team, have also been looking into using some of these same building blocks on mass modeling tasks as well. So, but it's a good question. It's like, all the things all at once. But yes, it's been a kind of progression to get there. We do, though, I will say that I think that having behavior really can be very impactful in aligning many diverse data sets, right? Having something to really ground the model towards learning kind of more common and unified. And still, I think it's unclear from mass modeling, how do we still what is actually aligning the data in that case? Okay. Maybe things about the brain region or other information that can help. Okay. And so, all of this has happened really recently, right? Over the past 2 years or so. And what we've found is that with, these new tokenization and architecture and new objectives, they have allowed for scaling, right, which was part of our motivation at the beginning, both scaling across the number of subjects as well as the amount of time or recording hours. And so this just shows us out of many of these different models, the progress that we've seen just over the past few years in terms of, the number of subjects and the amount of time or recording hours. And so really transformers and these different models that I've described provide this new pathway towards building these, really large scale, potentially foundation models for neural data that can coalesce information from all of these different sources. Yes?
So when you build the new version of the model, foundation model, do you actually start from the initial model that you previously built, or you actually start from scratch?
In terms of like all these different models, or?
Retrain everything from scratch, or you started from the version one?
Oh, for like NDT 1, 2, and 3. So those are different. There's differences in the tokenization as well as the scale of the data. And so each of those were, like each new model was actually retrained from scratch. We have examples where you can pre-train and then you can fine-tune on other animals or other sessions or other tasks. So that would be the case where we take the model weights as is and then we just do some fine-tuning on the new data. But so far, I think because there's a lot of open questions about how to do this and what everything is beneficial for, we haven't yet, as a field, started with one model as our basis and then built from there. That's a good question. Okay. So, okay, it's 1:30 now. So what I'll say is that, what I've described are the building blocks, the things that have kind of happened over the past few years in terms of building out these models. But the process to get there was, really engineering and time intensive, right? And so scaling and writing both efficient code that allows you to easily adapt to new data sets is really challenging. And real-world data sets, especially in neuroscience, are very multimodal. They're very asynchronous. They contain events and time series. Also, when you have a really long recording, maybe one time you want to analyze it at a short time scale, and another time, you might care more about long-term trends, right? And so what this means is that we have these really rich data sets, but it's often quite hard to prepare them and get them in a format where we can actually start to scale up or even put them into a transformer in the first place. And so what we'll talk about for the rest of the tutorial are new tools that our team has been developing that really allow us to both sample really easily from these multimodal data sets and also train deep learning models on neural data. And we really think that, through accelerating and having better tools as a field, we're hoping that this will really help us to accelerate science within the field as well. And so to address some of these challenges, we have created a number of new tools for training deep learning models for neural data. This consists of 3 main packages, which we'll talk about today. The first is temporal data, which gives us a way of basically slicing through a data set and extracting all of these different multimodal event streams and putting them into a format that can be easily understood by PyTorch or by a deep learning framework. The second is brain sets. So, and actually, I'm just going to go ahead and step through them here because I have some schematics. So yeah, temporal data, as I said, it gives us a way of essentially, in the end, when we try to train a deep learning model, one of the main ingredients that goes into it is our data loader, right? And how to actually sample from our data set efficiently as we're pulling different chunks of data from different points in time or different data sets. And so temporal data is kind of the backbone that allows us to actually build out data samplers or these data loaders within PyTorch. And one of the really cool advantages of it is that it allows for what's called lazy loading, which means you don't have to pull your entire data set into memory and bin it and kind of move through it in a fixed way. It actually gives you a very flexible way to access within the data object some arbitrary chunk in time and then tokenize it however you want. So you could have, a different bin size or the different sampling rates over which you're pulling from. And so maybe this feels a little bit nuanced, but I think for those of you that have worked with these types of data sets, you might appreciate that this is not a trivial task. And so the lazy loading is like, instead of, pulling it all into memory, we can actually go through and pull down a chunk quite easily when we're building out our batch for deep learning training. Okay. And then, so all of this comes together and culminates in what we call TorchBrain, which we're hoping, like in the graph community, they have PyTorch geometric. There's all these tools that exist in other domains that just make things a lot easier, accelerate the advances. And so we're hoping that TorchBrain can be the beginning of that. And it's really just designed to be flexible, efficient, and scalable. And within TorchBrain, we can define different samplers. We have some models that are already built into TorchBrain that you can use. And we're hoping to expand on this further. So we're really excited to work with the community and you all. If you have things that you want to contribute, we're really excited to make this a community effort. So TorchBrain provides a collection of modules for building models for neurosciences. So we have, state-of-the-art transformer blocks, different tokenizers. Currently, we have implementations of Poyo and Poyo Plus in there, but we're really close to also being able to incorporate different mass models. So that's going to be coming soon, NDTs, and then as well as kind of more basic building blocks like the multi-layer perceptron, temporal convolutional networks, as well as the multitask masking approach that I talked about earlier. And then finally, BrainSets is a collection of standardized data sets that are already ready for training. So for people that are interested in testing their model or benchmarking different models on some of these existing data sets, these are already available here. A lot of these are actually, all of the ones currently are non-human primates doing a variety of different reaching tasks, but we're also going to be releasing the Allen Brain Observatory, calcium imaging, as well as the IBL and the Falcon benchmark through BrainSets. So we're hoping that this can also allow for reproducibility and for everyone to be able to easily kind of, use new data sets to test their models. Okay, so that takes us to the end of this first session. In summary, so I've talked about how transformers provide a way to model neural data and learn very complex functions of neural dynamics. We talked about the main building blocks for transformers, so how to tokenize, what are the architectures, what are some of the different objectives, neuroscience. Motivating things through this notion of, wanting to scale and needing kind of efficient code and infrastructure to do that. And then finally, just telling you a little bit of an overview of these new packages that we'll be diving into now. Okay, and I'll release all the slides so you all have it. So then I also have these references to many of the models that I talked about here. With just a little bit of info on them. And then finally, just before we switch over to the interactive portion, I just wanted to give a plug. So we're going to be hosting a 2-day workshop here at the conference or during the workshop sessions on foundation models for neuroscience. And so if you're interested in learning more about these topics, we'll have a number of really exciting talks as well as panel discussions. And so I hope that you can join us for some of that. And then also there's going to be a upcoming symposium that will also be really talking about scaling and a lot of these topics at Champollion in October. So please put that on your calendars as well. Okay, great. So this will be the time that we're gonna start to transition over to the Colab notebooks, and we'll start going through those. For each of them, I'll kind of walk us through some of the ideas and kind of ground us in the content, and then you will have some time to work through some different exercises and the notebook. So go ahead and open up your laptops if you don't have them already, and you can find the materials at this link here. So cosyne-tutorial-2025.github.io. Cool. So I think we have maybe like about 10 minutes just to kind of transition, give you guys a little break to let that all settle in. And if you need to, if you already have everything pulled up, do try to like go ahead and run, because we were having, it's like a lot of people trying to request an instance. And so just making sure everyone can get theirs going. And so we'll start back up at 1:50. So 10 minutes. I think we'll get started with the first notebook. Okay. Alrighty. So hopefully everyone has been able to get a T4 instance. Okay. All the TAs are just so excited to help you with these next parts. Okay, so as I've already sort of motivated in the slides, the idea behind TorchBrain was to be able to make training deep learning models on neural data, easy and efficient. And so in this first notebook, we're going to kind of go through some of the main components that allow us to build out data objects that then will allow for this lazy loading and very efficient sampling of the data within TorchBrain. So within this notebook, there's three main parts. The first is just talking about data and data objects. The second part is talking about slicing, so this notion of kind of pulling out a chunk through this data object, which could actually be very large and not even fit onto your memory. And then the third part is kind of going into then how do we build samplers using this framework. Okay, and we have our documentation here. The documentation is like very interactive, a lot of visuals, and so I hope also any questions that you all have about this, you can also dive into some of the documentation and of course ask us today or in the future. Okay, so the first part is, here, let me just zoom in a little more. Okay, great. So what is, in terms of temporal data and these different objects, what are kind of the main components, right? And so I've already talked about this a little bit, this idea that in neuroscience, we often have multimodal data, right? That could be like, let's say we have a behavior of a reaching movement, right? Or a cursor, which is actually, sampled at some underlying rate and is a regular time series object. In addition to behavior, we also have irregular time series. So as we talked about, if we're looking at spikes, these are irregular because they're not sampled at exactly the same rate, right? It's just whenever a spike occurs. So we could have long stretches of time where we have no events. And so in order to efficiently represent those sorts of sparse data formats, we don't want to just bin everything and put a lot of zeros in between, right? So really dealing with the true nature of these event-based data requires a different way of formatting that information. So we have regular time series, irregular time series. Oh, yeah, so this is like the idea of event data here, but then also we could have irregular time series where maybe we're missing data over some chunk, like maybe we turned off our recording device and we weren't recording some pieces of that data consistently over time, as well as intervals, which could represent any number of things. So like trial start, trial end is one example of where we have an interval over which maybe when we want to process our data, we only want to constrain ourselves to certain types of intervals and not over the whole stretch of time. And so these are really unique data formats that I think in neuroscience and maybe other areas of science are kind of really unique to us. And so when working with this data, we might, in some cases, have to do things like, okay, I have some bin size for my spike data, and I have some frame rate over which I'm capturing some behavioral information. So oftentimes we just end up aligning everything and defining the same sampling rate so you can have like a one-to-one mapping between each of your behaviors and each of your bins, right? And so this can, for some types of analyses, potentially be limiting. And so I think, this gives us a way to more flexibly define a lot of these different sources of information or with different frame rates. Okay, so the first thing we'll do is just install the package, so temporal data. It's in pip, yay! So it's just pip install. Okay, and just for this tutorial and just to kind of step through these things, we're going to be working to start with just a single session. So we're pulling from the Dandy archive, which if you haven't heard of Dandy, it's an open repository for a lot of different types of neural data as well as behavior. This is all in NWB format. And so this is just, pulling down one session's worth of data, but we can actually, in these scalable models, be able to use this repository to easily pull down many different sessions or different types of data sets. Okay. And so the session that we'll use in this example is from Matt Parrish and Lee Miller, so Lee Miller's lab at Northwestern. They have a non-human primate performing, in this case, just a simple center outreaching task. In some of the models that we've trained on, there's diverse types of reaching or using like a touch screen, but in this case, the animal is holding a planar manipulandum, and they'll see a cue towards one of 8 different targets, and will be instructed to reach over all of these different cues that it receives. And so this data set will consist of neurons both from premotor areas as well as primary motor, so PMD and M1. And at the output, we'll have the cursor position in both X and Y. So we have a 2-dimensional behavioral output that we'll be interested in visualizing and potentially decoding with a decoding-based with a decoding-based model using transformers. Okay. And so to start, so this is really cool. This notebook is super interactive, and it might actually be useful for analyzing your own data or playing with data. So, oh yeah, so basically you'll see this symbol here for the different interactive cells within the notebook, and so you can actually go through and play with them. So this is really cool. We're just visualizing the neural population activity, so spikes, as well as these reach interval objects that I've kind of already alluded to. And then this is the velocity in X and velocity in Y. And so here we can actually press play. Isn't that so cool? You can also speed it up if you want to go through brain activity in 8x time. And so what we can see here is, really just motivating this idea that reach intervals don't always happen at exactly the same chunk in time. This could be something that is encoded within your data, but is actually not so easy to like standardize and to, say, oh, every 10 seconds we have another reach, right? So this is showing us all of the aspects of the data within this particular data set. Okay, and so now what I'll talk to you about are how to actually, when we build a brain sets, when we prepare raw data to be fed into this transformer or into TorchBrain, we need to encode all these different parts of the data set, the different objects. And so there are 4 main data objects within temporal data. We have intervals, regular time series, irregular time series, which we've already talked about. And then we also have a way of basically encoding, so just a array or a dictionary of vectors. So in the case where we have the Poyo model, where we have to actually learn unit embeddings for each of the different neurons, we can actually initialize them and define them using this object array dict. So here, I just have some examples of how you can actually read all of the different neurons within the recording into this array dict using temporal data. And so this also allows us to encode things about the location as well as all of the individual units. So here we also have representations of the different brain areas that each of the neurons come from. So this first object is representing the unit information. So at this point, it's just a lookup table basically for every neuron, and we're going to give it a unique identity. Okay, in addition to that, we have our irregular time series. So this allows us to encode timing and other information about the underlying spikes. And so here we just have an example of reading in all of the spikes into this irregular time series object. And I am not going through every line of this code. We don't actually have time, but I'm hoping that this provides a good starting point just to understand like what are all the different objects and what comes together within temporal data. Yes?
With a neuroscientific data set, we have spiking and behavior.
Yes.
What's a case where it's going to be better to use a regular time series embedding, not an irregular embedding?
So with the behavior, like let's say you're just recording, I don't know, the visual cue or something, and you have it on the screen and it's 30 frames per second. So really anything where there is a regular interval over which the data is collected can be represented as a regular time series. You could potentially also store it as an irregular time series object, but yeah, encoding it as regular is nice because you just basically specify the start and the end, and then over that, and the frame rate, and so then you assume that everything is regularly spaced over that interval. Okay. So, great. So now we've encoded the spikes as an irregular time series within temporal data. This is just So this is also interactive. Here we can see all of our spikes that that are encoded within our data set. Okay. The next type of data object is our regular time series. And so here, like anything that has to do with the behavior so things in this case like the cursor position, velocity, and acceleration can all be encoded as a regular time series. And so here we're just pulling from the NWB file these different fields, so the cursor position, velocity, and acceleration, and then we're creating our regular time series for all of these sources of data. So what's nice that we'll see later is maybe one model wants to extract out or predict the acceleration and another one wants to predict velocity. So we have a flexible way to query for each of those different sources of data. But at this point, all of that information can be stored within the same object. Okay. And this is just a visualization of the cursor position over time. We can see the complexity of this positional information embedded within this regular time series. Okay, and then finally, the other main piece of information is the interval, and that's used in this example to encode the trial tables, so the start and the end of different trials. And so here the interval is going to be encoded through the start and the end time, as well as maybe you have information about whether it was a success or a failed trial or any other metadata that has to do with that interval. And so you can also encode that in this values field, as well as the target ID, so where the animal was reaching to in this case. We'll have 8 different targets, and so all that information can be encoded into these different interval objects. Okay, and this is looking at a visualization. Where? Okay, sorry, I don't know if this is running. Okay, so this is now just visualizing all the different reach intervals. And so we can see that, there's chunks of time where they weren't being instructed to do any of these movements. And those can happen over very kind of irregularly spaced amounts of time. Okay, and so then finally, once we can extract all these different fields out of our NWB or out of our data file, we can put that all together into this data object, which is really a container for multiple temporal data objects, right? So all these different pieces that all come together. So in the end, this is really the key container that we'll use to then query and slice through different parts of the data set. And it has all of the different essential pieces. Okay. Once we define our data objects, we then will store this information into an H5 file. And so the thing that's really nice about H5 is it allows for this lazy loading that I talked about, where instead of pulling everything into memory, we can actually just pull down the chunks of data from this larger data set that we want to pull into our training loop or our batches. So really this is just to show you that under the hood, all these brain sets have already been prepared in this way where we take all the information from them, we put them into this data object, and we save everything as an H5 file so that then TorchBrain can easily, access and interface. Okay, so I know that we're running, wait, the break's at 2:15. So I guess at this point, I'm going to go through just these last 2 parts, and then we're going to have a 30-minute break for those of you that, want to do whatever during the break. awesome. For those of you that want to stick around and still play with the notebook, we'll also have the TA still here if you want to. Okay, so then in the rest of the notebook, we talk about how to slice data or slice through data objects. And so I want to just show you, this was the picture that we saw before. And so just at a high level, right, we have all of these different types or streams of data that are all in our data object. And now the key thing when we're defining our data samplers and data loaders is that we want to specify a start and an end time, and then we want to slice through this irregular time series in order to get out all the data from that start and end time, right? So we can think about when we were talking before about tokenization, we had like a context window, right, over which we were tokenizing. And so this could be thought of as like, slicing out a 1 second or some context window from the data. And so normally if you were trying to do this, there's a number of things that you'd have to do. Like first, is there even any data from a given field under the hood during that time? And so what this will do is just vary like all this code under the hood, but at the end of the day, we can actually specify the start and end time just in terms of absolute time, rather than the bin or the samples and say sample 10 through 30, right? We can actually just use time as a way to slice through this data object. And this is going to be what's actually happening within TorchBrain when defining the data loaders. And so then when we slice through the data, it'll give us some information about what are the things under the hood. So here in this example, in our slice, there's just one interval that overlaps with this particular slice or this chunk of time. The brain set or the data set, information about the session, as well as, we have the position, velocity, and acceleration, as well as the number of neurons that are all being encoded. So 55 neurons that are all part of the irregular time series. Okay. So now we can kind of put all this together. And so we have this data set object. And then what we can do in order to generate a sample, right, is to specify the recording ID as well as the start and the end time. And then we can actually just slice through. So at this point, we are now, pulling in the TorchBrain, so PyTorchBrain package in order to look at these different samples. And so we can, get within TorchBrain by specifying the ID, the start and the end time. So here we're just pulling out that first second worth of data. Okay. And so what's nice is that, okay, once we've defined this object, we have this idea of how we can slice through the data at some chunk in time, and create a sample with that. Within TorchBrain, we provide a number of data samplers that have kind of structured ways of pulling out these chunks of data, so to make things really easy. And so I guess the two main ways that one might just like naively or think about building samples for training their model. So as we know, we'll need some training data. We'll often need some validation data as well as some testing data, right? And so what we could do is we could just like take this whole chunk of time or the definition of the full recording, and we could just randomly sample these 1 second windows or these context windows from the data set, and we could randomly either assign them as a training, validation, or test. And so this is our random fixed window sampler where you can just tell it like, how much of the data you want to sample for the train, test, and val. And then we also have ways of, instead of doing just that randomly, you could also sequentially define your training, test, and validation. So now you only train on, like, say, the first half of the data, the next chunk might be for validation, and then the later subsequent times could be tests. So that could be a way to, instead of randomly sampling, you could actually use time as a way of slicing out your train, testing, and val. And I think, so this is an example of the random sampler. So we would define the amount of time. Each of these red boxes is showing each of these slices that we pulled out. And what we can see is if, like, we generate, this again, it's going to randomly sample the full chunk of time in a different way each time, right? So this is the random fixed window sampler. Ooh. So interactive. Yeah, cool. So this gives you a lot to play around with. Let's see. Okay, and then here I have this example where I've now split things over time, and we can see some of the different examples of what can be pulled out of here. Okay, boom, boom, boom. Okay, this just shows you that now we could also, like, only sample data from, say, when a reach is occurring, right? And so now we can also do set-wise operations to say, only give me training data or only give me valid samples over specific intervals. And so here we're seeing this example where we've left out certain chunks of time, and it can, automatically go in and find these things. Okay. So we're going to get more into the details of torch brain, but so we have a few different methods for manipulating neural data, including binning spikes. So it's nice because you could adaptively bin spikes at different rates as well. Okay. So now we will give you guys a break. And you can also check out some of the different exercises that we have here at the bottom. And hopefully you can start playing around with this notebook. Feel free to, we have 30 minutes now, so we'll come back at 2:45. And if anyone has a question, just raise your hand. The TAs will be ready to, come around and answer any questions that you have. All right, thank you so much.